You know M&Ms. You know Snickers. You know Twix, Mars bars, Skittles. And maybe even the dog food sitting in someone's kitchen right now. But here's the strange part. Behind all of those ordinary products is one of the richest, quietest, and most private families in the United States. Not a celebrity family. Not a Wall Street dynasty constantly smiling for the cameras. A family that built an empire so familiar that you have probably walked past it thousands of times without ever asking who owned it. And maybe that is the real genius of Mars. It hides in plain sight, in grocery aisles, in vending machines, in Halloween candy bowls, in pet stores, in childhood memories. A chocolate bar is never just a chocolate bar when it becomes a machine that prints billions across generations. So today, we are not following the candy. We are following the silence. We are following a family that learned something most empires forget. Sometimes, the greatest power is not being seen. Frank Mars was not supposed to build anything. That's the part the history books skip over. The part that doesn't fit neatly into the story of a candy empire. He was born in 1883 in rural Minnesota, a small town, a cold state. The kind of place where nobody gets famous and nobody expects to. His father was a grist mill operator. His mother was a woman named Alva, who by most accounts was the one who actually kept things together. When Frank was a child, he got polio. Now, polio in 1880s Minnesota wasn't just a disease. It was a verdict. It meant you couldn't run with the other kids. It meant you stayed inside while the world moved on without you. It meant long days at home next to your mother, learning how to exist in a smaller space than everyone else was given. And what did Alva do with that time? She made candy. Not as a business, not as a plan, just as something you did in a kitchen in Minnesota when the winters were long and the options were few. Hand-dipping chocolates, pulling taffy, the smell of sugar. On a cold afternoon. Frank learned by watching. He learned the way children learn things before they know they're learning. Through repetition, through proximity, through loving something before you understand what it's worth. By the time he was a teenager, he was selling candy door to door. And by the time he was a young man, he was already failing. His first venture collapsed, his second didn't get far enough to collapse. He got married, had a son named Forrest in 1904, got divorced not long after. A divorce so bitter and complete that Forrest was sent to live with his grandmother in Canada. And Frank essentially disappeared from his life. Think about that for a second. The man who would eventually build one of the most powerful food companies in the world. He couldn't hold together a marriage, a business, or a relationship with his own child. He was pushing 40 years old with nothing real to show for it. There's a version of Frank Mars where he just becomes a footnote, a minor, forgettable figure who tried a few things, failed quietly, and faded out. But that's not what happened. What happened is that Frank kept going. Not because he was inspiring. Not because he had a vision board or read the right books. But because making candy was the one thing he actually knew how to do. And at some point, when you failed enough times, the only move left is the thing you know. In 1920, Frank is 37 years old. He starts over again. Minneapolis this time. A small operation. A new wife named Ethel. A little bit of hope and a lot of debt. And here's where the story turns. Because around 1923, the idea comes. The story goes like this. Someone, and we'll get to who that someone actually was in a minute, had the thought of taking a malted milkshake and turning it into a candy bar. Putting the flavor of a diner counter inside a wrapper you could carry in your pocket. The Milky Way. It sounds simple now. It sounds obvious now. But in 1923, it wasn't obvious at all. Most candy at the time was either hard sugar or a thin coat of chocolate over something plain. Nobody had really thought about layering texture, nougat, caramel, chocolate. Something that felt substantial. Something that felt like a meal when you were hungry and a treat when you weren't. The first year, Mars Candy sold $40,000 worth of Milky Ways. The second year, nearly 800,000. That's not growth. That's ignition. And for a brief, glittering moment, it looked like Frank Mars had finally figured it out. He moved the operation to Chicago, built a real factory, got a railroad siding built right into the property so the trucks didn't have to wait. Created the Snickers bar in 1930, named reportedly after his favorite horse. Created the Three Musketeers bar in 1932. The empire was taking shape, but there was something Frank hadn't dealt with, a loose end. A son in Canada who had grown up without him, who had built his own ideas about the world, who had come back into Frank's life with opinions and ambitions and an energy that didn't sit still. His name was Forrest. And Forrest Mars was not the kind of man you ignored. Forrest Mars was not a warm man. People who knew him said that. People who worked for him said that. His own family, in rare unguarded moments, suggested something close to that. He was sharp, relentless. The kind of person who walked into a room and immediately started seeing everything that was wrong with it. Not because he was cruel, but because his mind didn't rest. It was always measuring, always comparing, always asking, why isn't this better? He'd grown up without his father, raised by his grandmother in a small Canadian town, while Frank was down in Minnesota failing at business and remarrying and starting over. Forrest didn't have the luxury of a father's safety net. He built himself from scratch, worked his way through Berkeley, then Yale, graduated with a degree in industrial engineering in 1928. And then he went to find his father. By that point, Frank Mars was finally successful. The Milky Way was selling, the Chicago factory was real. There was money, for the first time, actual money. And Forrest wanted in. He got in. For a few years, he worked inside the company, learned the operation, watched how everything moved. And somewhere in that process, Forrest developed a vision that was bigger than anything Frank had planned for. He wanted Europe. He saw what nobody else in that building was seeing. That chocolate wasn't just an American habit. It was a global one. That England, France, Germany, the whole continent was full of people who wanted something sweet and affordable and consistent. That an empire wasn't a factory in Chicago. An empire was everywhere. Simultaneously, Frank didn't see it that way. Frank was a man who had spent most of his life surviving. And when you've spent that long just trying not to fail, the idea of expansion sounds a lot like the beginning of the next collapse. He wanted to consolidate, protect what they built, keep it tight. The arguments between them became legendary inside the company. And at some point, the exact circumstances are disputed, but the result is not. Frank essentially forced Forrest out. He gave him $50,000, the international rights to the Milky Way recipe, and a door. Forrest later described the moment with words that don't belong in a family-friendly documentary. He was furious. He felt betrayed. He had come back to build something with his father, and instead, he'd been handed a consolation prize and told to go figure it out somewhere else.
So he did. He went to England. And what he built there, in a small factory in Slough, a town that nobody romanticizes, a place that George Orwell once wrote should be torn down and rebuilt from scratch, was extraordinary. He reformulated the Milky Way for British tastes, made it slightly different, denser, and called it the Mars Bar, launched it in 1932. It sold. Then he launched Maltesers in 1936. Then he got into pet food, actual dog food, canned meat, a company called Chappell Brothers. Because Forrest Mars was always thinking 3 moves ahead, and he understood something about pets that most people hadn't yet articulated. That people love their animals the way they love their children, and they'll spend accordingly. We'll come back to that. That seed he planted in 1934 will become, decades later, bigger than the chocolate that made him famous. But here's what's important to understand about Forrest in this period. He wasn't just building a business. He was building a philosophy. He spent time at Nestle, spent time at other European manufacturers, studied the Swiss approach to chocolate, the precision of it, the consistency, the idea that quality wasn't a value you stated. It was a system you built. He came back from those years with a conviction that would shape everything that came after. He believed that a great product had to be the same every single time. Not mostly the same, not usually the same, exactly the same. He used to say that the consumer was his boss, not the shareholders. There were none. He made sure of that. Not the board, the person at the end of the transaction, the person biting into the bar. If they noticed any difference between one wrapper and the next, something had failed. He reportedly tested his own products obsessively, tasted batches, measured consistency, walked factory floors at unexpected hours, asked questions that made his employees nervous because the questions were always precise and the tolerance for vague answers was 0. He was not a man you wanted to disappoint. His son, Forrest Jr., once said something that tells you everything about the culture of this family. I'm a religious man. I pray for Milky Way. I pray for Snickers. That sounds like a joke, until you realize he probably wasn't joking. This was a family that treated the product the way other families treated bloodlines, sacred, guarded, not to be diluted. And while all of this was happening in England, while Forrest was building his parallel empire with extraordinary discipline and controlled fury, his father was dying. Frank Mars died in 1934, kidney failure. He was 51 years old. He never reconciled with his son. He never saw what Forrest would eventually build. And Forrest, the boy who had been sent away, handed a check and told to go figure it out on his own, would spend the next 30 years quietly working his way back to the company his father had left behind. Not to honor it, to complete it.
There's a moment in 1940 that almost nobody talks about Forrest Mars. The exiled son. The man who built his European operation from scratch. The man who had every reason to stay in England and never look back. Comes back to the United States. He's 36 years old. He's been gone nearly a decade. He's built something real across the Atlantic. But America was always the bigger stage, and Forrest was always a man who needed the biggest stage available. He sets up a small operation in Newark, New Jersey, and then he goes to see a man named Bruce Murray. Now, Bruce Murray is not a name most people know, but his father is William Murray, the president of the Hershey Chocolate Company, the rival, the competition, the company that Frank Mars used to buy his chocolate from back before Mars could produce its own. Forrest had an idea for a new candy, small chocolate pieces, coated in a hard sugar shell so they wouldn't melt in your hand. He'd reportedly seen something similar during the Spanish Civil War. Soldiers eating chocolate tablets with a thin sugar coating, practical in the heat, easy to carry. He needed chocolate, and Hershey controlled the supply. So he went to the president's son. The deal they struck was simple and quietly audacious. They would go into business together. The candy would be named after both of them, Mars, Murray, M&M's, Bruce Murray. Got 20% of the new company in exchange for access to Hershey's chocolate supply at a favorable price. In 1941, the patent was filed. M&M's went into production. The timing was almost impossibly perfect. The United States entered World War II. The military needed compact, heat-resistant, high-calorie food for soldiers in the field. M&M's went straight into the sea rations. Millions of American soldiers ate them in Europe, in the Pacific, in the deserts and jungles and frozen mountain ranges of a world at war. When those soldiers came home, they brought the taste with them. And within a few years, Forrest bought out Bruce Murray's share for a fraction of what it would eventually be worth. That's a pattern worth noticing. Forrest Mars was extraordinarily good at partnerships that ended with him owning everything. Through the 1940s and 1950s, he kept building Uncle Ben's rice in 1943. A product designed around a real person, a black maitre d' named Frank Brown, whose image was used without his full ownership of the brand. A chapter the company would quietly revise decades later when they renamed it Ben's Original. The details of history are rarely clean. By the early 1960s, Forrest had two things. He had a significant American food operation, and he had an obsession. The company his father had left behind, Mars Candy in Chicago, now run by his half-sister Patricia and her husband, still profitable, still carrying the name. And Forrest wanted it back. Not out of sentiment, Forrest Mars was not a sentimental man. He wanted it because he had spent 30 years building a philosophy of how a food company should operate. and he wanted to apply that philosophy to the full scale of what the Mars name could become. In 1964, he made his move. The details of exactly how it happened are not fully public. This is a family that doesn't narrate its own history, but the result is documented. Forrest acquired the controlling interest in the original Mars operation, merged it with his own, and unified everything under one name: Mars Incorporated. He was 60 years old, and he ran it like a general who had just taken a city he'd been planning to take for 3 decades. What came next was not a celebration. What came next was a transformation. Forrest imposed his systems on everything. The factory floors were kept immaculate, not as a policy, but as a religion. He would arrive unannounced, walk the lines, stop at machines, ask questions no one expected. Employees learned to treat every day as if the founder might appear at any moment, because he might. He also imposed something unusual for a company of that size. Everyone punched a time clock. Everyone, executives, managers. Forrest himself, when he was in the building, there was no hierarchy expressed through different rules. You were either contributing or you weren't, and the clock was neutral about who you were. He called his employees associates, always with a capital A, not workers, not staff associates. The language was deliberate. Language is always deliberate when it comes from a man like Forrest Mars. He built what became known as the 5 principles: quality, responsibility, mutuality, efficiency, freedom. 5 words that sound like the kind of thing you hang on a lobby wall and forget about. But inside Mars, they weren't decoration. They were architecture. Every decision, every product, every relationship with a supplier, it was supposed to run through those 5 ideas. And above all of them, invisible but present in everything, was a 6th principle that was never written down: secrecy. Don't talk to the press. Don't share financial results. Don't explain yourself to people who don't work here. Don't give interviews. Don't appear on magazine covers. Don't make yourself a target. This wasn't paranoia. It was strategy. Forrest had watched what happened to public companies. He'd watched them bend their decisions to quarterly earnings, watched them make choices that served shareholders instead of products, watched them become something other than what they were built to be. He had no interest in that Mars would stay private, the family would stay invisible, and the product, the actual thing in the wrapper, would remain the only public face the company ever needed. He retired in 1973. By then, the empire was producing somewhere in the range of $1 billion a year. By then, the silence was fully operational, and the children he left behind, Forrest Jr., John, and Jacqueline, had been trained from the time they were young in the same discipline. Don't be seen. Don't be known. Let the candy speak. Most billionaire families fall apart by the 3rd generation. There's even a saying for it: shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. The 1st generation builds, the 2nd generation manages, the 3rd generation spends. And somewhere in that spending, the thing that was built quietly dissolves into lawyers and vacation homes and arguments over who gets what. The Mars family didn't do that. And understanding why they didn't is understanding something important about how real power actually works. Forrest Mars raised 3 children. Forrest Jr., born in 1931, John, born in 1935, Jacqueline, born in 1939. He raised them inside the discipline he had built his entire life around, not around wealth, around work, around product. Around the idea that what you built was only worth keeping if you understood deeply and personally what made it worth building. The children worked in the factories, not symbolically, not as a publicity gesture. They actually worked. They learned the machinery. They understood the process from the inside out. John Mars has spoken. In the very few moments he's spoken publicly about anything, about knowing the equipment, knowing the floors, knowing what it smelled like when something was off. That's not an accident of upbringing. That's an intentional inheritance. Forrest C.R. believed, with the kind of conviction that doesn't leave room for debate, that you couldn't lead something you didn't understand from the ground up, that authority earned from proximity to the actual work was the only authority worth having. So the children learned. And when Forrest retired in 1973, the three of them took over together. Not one of them, all three, equal shares, equal voice. A structure designed to prevent exactly the kind of dominance battles that tear other family empires apart. It mostly worked. Forrest Jr. eventually settled in Wyoming, Sheridan, specifically, a small city near the Montana border, far from the financial centers of the country, far from the cameras. He became, in his later years, quietly generous in that community. A donation to the local theater, a contribution to a museum, a skating rink for kids that carries a name you'd recognize if you knew where to look. He gave a lot. He just gave it without a press release. John stayed closer to the business. Jackson, Wyoming eventually became his home. He is, to this day, the last surviving member of the third generation with an active role in the company. When Forbes compiled their list of the wealthiest people in America for years running, John Mars appeared on it with a simple notation next to his name: no photo available. Not because they couldn't find one, because he had made sure, with great deliberateness, that none existed in circulation. Think about what it takes to be worth tens of billions of dollars and remain genuinely, photographically invisible to the American press. That is not an accident. That is a life's work. Jacqueline Mars is, in some ways, the most public of the three, which is to say, she is almost entirely private by any normal standard. She served on the board. She ran the food division for years. She was involved deeply and operationally in the business. She was also, in 2013, involved in a car accident in rural Virginia that killed one person and injured others. She had crossed the center line. She pleaded guilty to reckless driving. It was the most public moment any member of this family had experienced in decades. And even then, even with the tragedy of it, the legal proceedings, the coverage, it felt strange to see a Mars name in a headline. Like something had slipped through a gap that was supposed to be sealed, because that's what this family had become. A sealed world. And while the family managed its silence, the business was doing something that almost nobody was watching closely enough to notice. It was changing shape. The chocolate empire. The thing everyone associated with the Mars name was still there. Still enormous. Still printing money. With every Halloween and every vending machine and every checkout line in America. But something else was growing alongside it, quietly, steadily, with the same deliberate patience that characterized everything the Mars family had ever done. In 1934, back when Forrest was in England building his parallel operation, he had bought a small British company called Chapel Brothers. They made canned dog food. It wasn't glamorous.
It wasn't what anyone would have called a vision. It was just Forrest thinking ahead, noticing that people loved their pets and that the market for feeding them was completely underdeveloped. That purchase was the seed. And for decades it grew slowly, branching out, adding brands, adding categories. Pedigree, Whiskas, Caesar, Sheba, names you recognize because they're in your grocery store, in your pantry, maybe in your pet's bowl right now. Then in 2001, Mars spent $730 million to acquire Royal Canin, a French premium pet food company that had built its reputation on veterinary-grade nutrition, breed-specific formulas, the kind of product that a certain type of pet owner would pay almost any price for. That acquisition signaled something. Mars wasn't just in pet food anymore. Mars was moving toward controlling the entire relationship between a pet and its owner. The food, the treats, and eventually, the medical care. In 2007, they acquired Banfield Pet Hospital, over 1,000 locations, many of them inside PetSmart stores. Not just selling food to pet owners, now examining their animals, building relationships with veterinarians, collecting data on pet health across the country. In 2017, they spent $9.1 billion, billion, with a B, to acquire VCA. Another 1,000 hospitals, specialty care, emergency medicine, the kind of facilities where people spend $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 trying to save an animal they love. $9 billion. From a company that started with a man in Minnesota making candy next to his mother. That's not a footnote in the Mars story. That's the next chapter. And most people eating a Snickers have no idea. It's happening.
Let's talk about money. Not the kind of money you and I think about. Not mortgages and car payments and whether you can afford to take a vacation this year. The other kind. The kind that exists in a different atmosphere entirely. The kind that compounds across generations, that moves through holding structures and private agreements and family trusts that never appear in a newspaper. Because they were specifically designed never to appear in a newspaper. The Mars family fortune is estimated, depending on who's counting and how, at somewhere around $117 billion, to put that in human terms. Because large numbers stop meaning anything after a certain point. That is more than the GDP of most countries on Earth. It is the second largest family fortune in the United States, behind only the Waltons of Walmart. It is larger than the individual net worth of almost every name you immediately think of when you think of American wealth. And it was built entirely without ever selling a share of stock to the public. That matters more than people realize. When a company goes public, when it lists on a stock exchange and sells pieces of itself to outside investors, it gains access to enormous capital. But it also gives something away that it can never fully get back. It gives away a piece of its decision-making. It becomes obligated legally and culturally to manage itself in ways that satisfy people who don't work there, who don't understand the product, who don't care about the long game. They care about this quarter. They care about the number that comes out in the earnings call. They care about the line on the chart. Forrest Mars Sear watched this happen to other companies and made a decision that his children and grandchildren have honored ever since Mars would never go public. The family would fund its own growth, make its own decisions, and answer to nobody outside the bloodline. That freedom, and they actually call it freedom, it's one of their 5 principles, is what allowed them to make moves that a public company simply could not make. In 2008,
during one of the worst financial crises in American history, when banks were collapsing and companies were freezing any spending that wasn't essential. Mars spent $23 billion to acquire the Wrigley Company. $23 billion Orbit Extra Double Mint Juicy Fruit Eclipse 5 gum. The entire chewing gum category, essentially, in one transaction. And to do it, they partnered with Warren Buffett, who contributed $6.5 billion through Berkshire Hathaway in the form of subordinated debt and a small equity stake. Think about what it means that Warren Buffett, the man whose entire philosophy is built around understanding the long-term value of great businesses, chose to put his money alongside the Mars family. It means he understood something about them that the public didn't fully see, that they weren't a candy company. They were a machine. A machine for identifying categories people will always spend money on, moving into those categories quietly and completely, building brands that become habitual, and then holding those positions for decades without ever needing to explain themselves to anyone. In 2016, Mars bought back Buffett's stake and took full ownership of Wrigley, completely theirs again. Then came the pet care expansion we talked about last block, the Royal Canin acquisition, the Banfield hospitals, the VCA deal for $9 billion, the British veterinary chain Linnaeus, the Swedish veterinary network Anicure and Tech Diagnostics, a veterinary lab company that processes millions of tests a year, feeding data back into a health system that Mars now essentially owns from the food bowl to the operating table. And then, in August of 2024, the largest acquisition in the company's history, Kellanova, $35.9 billion Pringles, Cheez-It Pop-Tarts, Rice Krispies, Treats Eggo waffles, brands that live in American pantries the way childhood memories live in the mind. Present, comfortable, unexamined.
The deal closed in December of 2025. After regulatory approval in Europe, in the United States, Mars Incorporated now generates over $54 billion in annual sales. It employs more than 150,000 people across more than 80 countries. It owns $17 billion brands. It is the largest private veterinary care provider in the United States. And the family that owns all of it paid themselves $1.5 billion in dividends in 2024 alone. $1.5 billion in a single year. From a company that almost nobody can describe with any accuracy. Now here's the part that should sit with you for a moment. While all of this growth was happening, while the acquisitions were stacking and the brands were multiplying and the veterinary empire was expanding, there was a shadow on the supply chain that no press release could fully address. Cocoa, the chocolate that makes the Snickers and the M&Ms and the Twix and the Mars bar, comes primarily from West Africa, from the Ivory Coast and Ghana, where approximately 70% of the world's cocoa supply originates. And for decades, journalists, advocacy groups, and eventually the United States Department of Labor have documented one of the most uncomfortable truths in the global food industry. Children pick that cocoa, not teenagers working summer jobs. Children as young as 5 years old, working on farms in dangerous conditions, using machetes, carrying loads far beyond what their bodies should carry, often without access to education. In 2001, Mars and several other major chocolate companies signed something called the Harkin-Engel Protocol, a voluntary agreement to eliminate the worst forms of child labor from their supply chains by 2005. 2005 came the problem remained, new deadline 2005.
Same result in 2021. The international rights advocates filed a federal lawsuit in Washington, D.C., naming Mars, Nestle, Hershey, and others, representing 8 Malian citizens who alleged they had been trafficked as children to harvest cocoa. Mars's response was a single sentence delivered by email: "We don't comment on pending litigation." In 2023, a CBS News crew filmed children as young as 5 years old picking cocoa on farms that supplied Mars in Ghana. Mars launched a program called Cocoa for Generations. $1 billion over 10 years. Traceability goals, sustainability commitments, targets for a segregated supply chain by 2030. Whether that program is enough, whether it is sincere or strategic or both, is a question this video cannot answer for you. What it can say is this: the same discipline that kept this family invisible for 100 years, the same patience that allowed them to build without explaining themselves to anyone, that same silence has surrounded this chapter too. They don't argue about it publicly. They don't get emotional about it. They issue statements and launch programs and quietly continue building. And somewhere in that combination, the extraordinary achievement and the unresolved cost of it is where the real story of the Mars family lives. Not in the candy, in the silence around the candy.
There's a question I've been sitting with through this entire story. And I think you've been sitting with it too, even if you haven't put words to it yet. It's not about the money. We've covered the money. $117 billion, private, invisible, compounding across 4 generations, while the family that owns it refuses to appear in a photograph. It's not even about the controversy, the cocoa, the children, the lawsuits. That chapter is real and uncomfortable and unresolved, and we should hold it honestly. The question is something quieter than all of that. It's this: what does it mean to build something that everyone uses but nobody truly sees? Think about the last week of your life, the food in your house, the gum in your car, the treats you gave your dog, the vet clinic where you took your cat last year, the Pringles at the party, the Pop-Tarts your kid grabbed before school. Mars was probably in that week. More than once. Maybe more than you'd be comfortable admitting. And yet, you would not have named them. You would not have thought of the family. You would not have connected any of those moments to 3 quietly wealthy siblings in Wyoming and Virginia, who inherited the most disciplined private empire in American history. That invisibility, that complete, total, architectural invisibility, is not an accident. It is the product. Before I continue, and I want to, because we're not quite done, there's one more layer to this story that I think matters. I need to stop here for just a moment. If you've stayed with me this far, through the history and the money and the silence and the complexity of it, that means something. It means you're the kind of person who doesn't just want the headline. You want to understand what's underneath it. And if that's who you are, I'd like to keep doing this with you. Subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell if you want to know when the next one drops. Because we're going to keep following these invisible empires, the families and companies and systems that shape your daily life without ever asking your permission or introducing themselves. This is the kind of content I believe you deserve. Not noise, not outrage, just the real story, told carefully. Now, back to the Mars family, because there's something we haven't talked about yet.
The fourth generation Forrest Jr. died in 2016. His 1/3 share of Mars Incorporated passed to his 4 daughters, Victoria, Pamela, Valerie, Mirage. 4 women who inherited not just equity, but a culture, a set of expectations about how you carry this kind of weight. Victoria Mars became the first woman to chair the company's board. She also became the first corporate ombudsman in Mars history, a role created specifically to give associates a confidential channel to raise concerns.
She gave a rare interview in 2021 to a private wealth management firm and spoke about what it means to steward a company for over a century. She said something that stuck with me. She talked about the difference between ownership and stewardship, that the family doesn't think of itself as owning Mars in the way you might own a car or a house, that the company existed before most of them were born and will exist after most of them are gone, that their job is not to extract from it but to maintain it, to hand it to the next generation in better shape than they received it. Now you can hear that and be moved by it. It's genuinely beautiful language. You can also hear it and ask a harder question. Is that stewardship? Or is that the most elegant possible framing for the fact that this family paid themselves $1.5 billion last year from a company that has repeatedly failed to meet its own deadlines on child labor in its cocoa supply chain? Both things can be true simultaneously. That's the part of this story that doesn't resolve cleanly. The Mars family has built something genuinely remarkable, a multi-generational private empire that has survived the pressures, financial, competitive, political, technological, that have destroyed most companies of its age and scale. They have done it with discipline and patience, and a commitment to quality that is, by most accounts, completely real. They have also done it in an industry whose foundation rests, in part, on supply chains they have known about, documented, and not fully fixed for over 20 years. John Mars is in his late 80s, the last of the 3rd generation with an active role, a man who spent decades as the wealthiest person in America, with no publicly available photograph. A man who, in a culture that cannot stop performing itself online, simply chose not to exist in the visible world. What remains when he is gone is a company now run primarily by the 4th generation women. Mostly a different sensibility, perhaps a different relationship to transparency. Victoria's interview suggests someone who thinks carefully about legacy, about what it means to hold something this large. Whether that thinking translates into the kind of accountability that the cocoa question demands. Whether the Cocoa for Generations program becomes a genuine transformation or a permanent work in progress is a story still being written. But here is what I know. The machine is still running. The candy is still selling. The pets are still being fed and treated by a company most of their owners have never heard of. And the family behind all of it is still, largely, right where they've always been. Out of frame. I want to take you back to the beginning. Not the beginning of this video. The real beginning. A small kitchen in Minnesota. A woman named Alva and a boy who couldn't run outside because his legs didn't work the way other children's legs worked. Long winters. The smell of sugar. Hands learning something slowly. without knowing what they were learning. That's where this started. Not in a boardroom, not with venture capital, not with a pitch deck or a vision statement, or any of the language we use now to describe the beginning of something important. It started with a woman teaching a sick child something sweet to do with his hands. And 100 years later, that child's great-grandchildren are worth $117 billion. Run the largest private veterinary network in the United States, sell candy in 180 countries and have not, as a family, as a unit, as a dynasty, given a single meaningful press conference in living memory. There is something in that arc that I keep turning over, because we tell a certain kind of story about success in this country. We tell it loudly. We put the founder on the magazine cover. We make the documentary. We build the mythology. We need to see the face behind the thing. The Mars family looked at that tradition and made a different choice. They decided that the product was the face, that the candy bar in your hand, the bag of dog food in your car, the vet who saw your cat on a Tuesday afternoon. That those things were the company's autobiography, that you didn't need to know their names to be in a relationship with them. And in some ways, that's the most honest version of what a business can be. You don't care who made the chair you're sitting in. You care that it holds you. But there's another way to read that same silence, because silence, at a certain scale, is not just modesty. Silence is protection. It protects you from scrutiny, from accountability, from the kind of sustained public pressure that forces companies to change things they would rather not change. The cocoa supply chain has been documented, litigated, and publicly criticized for over 2 decades, and Mars has responded the way it responds to everything, with measured language, internal programs, and a patience that outlasts any news cycle. They can afford to wait. Most people cannot, and that asymmetry between the people who have time on their side and the people who don't is quietly, persistently, one of the most important dynamics in the world we live in. I'm not telling you to hate the Mars family. They built something real, something that required discipline across 4 generations, which is almost impossible to do. Something that survived the failures and the exile and the bitterness between a father and a son, and came out the other side more powerful than either of them could have imagined. Forrest Mars. Seer once said, "I wanted to conquer the whole goddamned world." He didn't quite get there, but his grandchildren are close. The question worth sitting with, and I mean really sitting with, not just nodding at, is not whether the Mars family is good or bad. That's too simple a question for a story this complex. The question is what we notice about power when it stays quiet. What we never ask because the product is too familiar. What we never demand because the brand is too comfortable. What accountability looks like when the people being held accountable are, by design, impossible to find. You know their candy. You feed it to your children. You buy their gum before a long flight. You take your dog to their hospital. And you have never, not once, not in a grocery store, not in a vet's waiting room, not in a gas station at midnight staring at a rack of Snickers. You have never looked at any of those things and thought about the family in Wyoming. That is not a coincidence. That is 100 years of careful, deliberate, generational work. And whether you find that impressive or unsettling, or both, which is where I land, probably says something about where you stand on the oldest question in the history of building things. Is it enough to make something good? Or do you owe the world more than that? Frank Mars died at 51 with sugar on his hands, and a son he never reconciled with Forrest Mars. Sear lived to 95, conquered most of what he set out to conquer, and gave one interview in his entire life. Neither of them ever answered that question directly. Maybe they didn't think it was theirs to answer. Maybe that's the whole point. If this video made you think, if it made you look at something ordinary in a different way, share it with 5 people who would understand why it matters. Not because it's viral, because this kind of story deserves a thoughtful audience. And you probably know 5 people who qualify. Subscribe to the channel. We do this every week. Not noise, not outrage, just the real architecture of the world explained carefully. And leave a comment below. Tell me what landed for you. Tell me what you're still sitting with. And tell me, which invisible empire do you want us to follow next? I'll be reading.